My first guest tonight has been a longtime advocate for redistricting reform, first in the Assembly and now in his role as a senator. Mike Gianaris has sponsored several redistricting bills. He's joining us tonight from New York City to talk more about the governor's proposal. Thanks very much for your time, Senator. How are you doing?
I'm good, Liz. Thanks for having me back.
It's good to see you, and I think that you, of all people, are able to get right down into the details of this bill, so let's just jump right in. First of all, how is this different than your bill in any significant way?
Well, it's very, very similar, which I'm very happy to see, obviously. The one thing I think that I noticed in a quick read of it earlier today that was different was in the appointees to the nominating commission. In other words, the people who get to select the pool from which the commission comes. The original bill I had drafted actually had all the statewide elected officials included in that list, and at the request of Senate Republicans last year, who were concerned that all the statewide elected officials were Democrats, we removed that provision, and it was just, in the bill as it stands now, just the legislative leaders. In the governor's bill, he has added back gubernatorial appointees to the committee that nominates the pool.
Okay,
outside of that, it's very similar.
Why does that make sense? I mean, we're talking about redistricting legislative lines and congressional lines. Why should the governor have a say in that at all until it comes time to approve or veto the bill?
Well, the interesting thing is there's two ways to look at making redistricting fairer. One is to make it bipartisan. In other words, remove the advantage that the majority parties in either house have. And the other is to make it more independent of the legislature entirely, and by allowing the governor to pick people. It's actually a couple layers removed. He will be picking people that pick people to be on the commission.
Right.
So it's not as if the governor actually has appointees to the commission itself, but it gives him a little bit of influence and gives someone other than legislators a little bit more influence in the process, which is probably a good thing in the end.
Well, had this been any governor other than Andrew Cuomo, I might point out that he is a Democrat, and in fact that might benefit the Democrats in the Senate and or the Assembly, but he's been acting a lot more like a Republican of late, so maybe that doesn't matter. In addition, I mean, the reality is, look, there are more Democrats in New York than there are Republicans. There's just no two ways about it. And so if we do, quote-unquote, fair redistricting, aren't the Democrats going to benefit? I mean, isn't that what all this is about? No more gerrymandering.
Well, I mean, you make an interesting point. You know, we just learned earlier this week that there were 240,000 more votes cast for state Senate candidates on the Democratic line last year than on the Republican line, which means that the Senate we have right now is Republican, not because more voters wanted it that way, but because the districts are drawn so disproportionately. So I think, you know, you make an interesting point. On the other hand, the Assembly, one can argue, has done just the same thing to give the Democrats there an even larger advantage than is justified by the registration advantage in the state. So it will create greater balance in both houses.
So just to be clear for people who are watching this without getting too technical, in order to try and take the politics out of this, or at least put some sort of layer in so there is not direct control by the legislature, you set up a situation that's actually a little bit convoluted. I mean, I'm sorry. You have a committee that picks people. You have people picking a committee that then picks people to make a decision. Isn't that a little crazy?
I don't think it's crazy. I think it works, but it is a little complicated.
Right.
And the reason to do that is to create as many layers of removal from the legislature itself and the people who are actually serving on the commission. And it's not just that we have these layers, but it's also that we have requirements as to who can serve on the commission itself and within the pool to be selected for the commission. We have restrictions on legislators and their families, restrictions on lobbyists. None of those can serve. And we also have requirements that there be a geographic balance in the pool of candidates, as well as an ethnic balance, which is important to the state.
Okay, Senator, the rule is actually pretty strict. It says that whoever you are, if you're going to be eligible, for the last 4 years, you cannot have been an elected official, you cannot have worked for an elected official, you cannot have worked for state government, period, not for the second floor, which would be any executive agency. You can't have been a registered lobbyist. You can't be married to a member of an elected body, which no legislature, no House spousal members. You can't be even related to them. You can't be their kid. You can't be their cousin. Who's left, really?
Who's left are hopefully average New Yorkers who don't have a stake personally in what happens with the redistricting process. There are plenty of experts at our institutions of higher education or out of our good government groups, people that have experience that I think could be good to serve on this. I'm not here to select that pool with you tonight, but the idea was, as much as possible, let's peel this away from the people that have a personal stake in this, so that, you know, I know this is cliche at this point because we've said it so many times, but we want voters to choose their elected officials. We don't want elected officials or people so close to them that it matters to them choosing who gets to vote for them.
Okay, but just to play devil's advocate for a second, are we saying that we don't believe at all a person who has been in office but is no longer in office could be eligible possibly to make a decision? I mean, who better than a former elected official who actually understands some of what you speak? I mean, particularly if that person was defeated.
Yeah, and former elected officials are allowed to speak. We just don't want them to be so close to their time in service. Not different from the lobbying ban which exists now, which is, I believe, a 2-year ban on legislators before they can lobby the legislature. So I think it's a fair compromise. It's a certain amount of time from when somebody left to make sure that they really are more independent than the other folks.
The other thing that's interesting that's in here, and we're going to get a little technical. I feel like there should be sort of warning, like technical alert. Here we go. You basically say that there has to be a certain number of people in a district, right? In order for there to be fair representation, every elected official has to represent the same number of people, give or take a certain percentage deviation, and that's where it gets tricky. Now it's a 5% deviation. You guys in this bill, sorry, not you, the governor is suggesting 1%. From what I've been told, that would mean that 53 of the existing 62 Senate districts would be out of compliance. Is that true?
Yeah, well, that is true. And I have the same standard in my legislation as well. That's one of the areas where the bills are exactly the same. And one of the ways in which the political parties have overstated their advantage is by playing with the deviation. It says 5% either way right now, but that really means 10% because you can go 5% above the average and 5% below the average. What's ended up happening is on the Senate side, Democratic districts have been overpopulated so that fewer senators would be elected from Democratic districts, and Republican districts have been underpopulated. And on the Assembly side, it's exactly the reverse, where you have the Democratic districts underpopulated, Republican districts overpopulated. It should be as close to even as possible. 1% is a fair standard. It's very doable, and I think it would eliminate one of the biggest abuses of the redistricting process.
Okay, but again, doesn't this also come back to the same question, which is it in fact possible to have things be fair, quote unquote, from a Republican standpoint, if in fact the state is so heavily Democrat dominated in its enrollment?
Well, of course it's possible to make it fair. The question is whether a fair process works for them.
If you were a Republican, you wouldn't say that.
No, I would say that. In fact, you know, we had Senator Bonachik and Senator Young were sponsors of this bill last year. It's interesting to see where they're going to stand as this goes forward. I mean, I'm not even getting into the fact that the entire Republican conference signed the pledge that promised to support this proposal, and yet they've been waffling ever since.
Did they promise to support your bill? Is that correct? They promised that they would support the redistricting legislation that had been introduced at that time, which was your bill. You were carrying it in the Assembly at the time, and then it was being carried in the Senate by, I think, Dave Valesky. Am I wrong about that?
No, that's correct.
Okay, but now we've got a wholly new bill. Nobody promised to support this bill. I don't think anybody pledged to support Andrew Cuomo's bill. It was your bill that they promised they'd support.
Right. Well, at this point, I'll take them supporting my bill. The bills are, as far as I could tell, 95% exactly the same word for word. The governor did do some changes that I'm sure he'd be open to talking to, but I think everyone who's advocating on this issue would be happy if we ended up with my bill, with the governor's bill, with something in between. Any of those options would represent significant progress. I'm just thrilled that the governor's engaged on this issue. He made a promise to support independent redistricting too, just like everybody else, and he has taken a big step forward in fulfilling that pledge today.
Okay, so can you give me some idea? Now, I know you're in the minority in the Senate, but can you give me some idea about what's going to happen? Who's going to carry this bill in that chamber? And is it possible that it would actually come up for a vote at some point? I mean, we have heard at this point vague discussions in the Assembly from the Speaker, Sheldon Silver, that there needs to be some sort of reform, but of course, devil's in the details. 19 pages worth of details, very convoluted and difficult. And then we've seen Senate Majority Leader Dean Scalia say, well, maybe I'd prefer a constitutional amendment, which is actually quite difficult to get through. So what's the future for this particular piece of legislation?
Well, let me just point out that on the Assembly side, it's my understanding that Speaker Silver has introduced the governor's bill under his own name, and so that's a major statement as well on that side. On our side, a program bill, when it's submitted by the governor, the party in control has the first option on it, so I think it's in Senator Skelos' hands now. as to whether he or one of the members of his conference wants to introduce it. If they do not, then it becomes open to everybody, and I'm sure I or Senator Sampson or someone on our side would be happy to.
Okay, but we know that the way things work in Albany is that simply by introducing a bill does not necessarily mean it's going somewhere. It just means that it starts going through the committee process, right? So we don't know necessarily it is or is not going to hit the floor. Do we probably expect that this is going to be running after the budget, or do you think concurrent with the budget we're actually going to have this conversation?
Well, as you know, Liz, you and I have spoken about this a number of times. Our point of view is we have 53 out of 62 senators promising to support legislation establishing an independent commission. There's no reason when you have that kind of overwhelming bipartisan support that the bill shouldn't be put on the floor at the next available moment and pass it. So I would argue the sooner the better.
Okay, well, we shall see. In the meantime, I want to thank you very much for coming in to help us make sense of this because it is a little bit tricky. Senator Mike Gianaris, I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Liz.